There is a moment, and you've had it, I promise you, where you walk into a room, and something is wrong. Not wrong in a way you can name. Not wrong in any way that would hold up if you tried to explain it to someone else. Just wrong. The people in the room are smiling. The conversation is normal. Nobody is doing anything suspicious. But you feel it. This low, cold certainty. That something has already been decided. That you are the last person in the room to know. This video is about that feeling. Where it comes from. Why it's almost never wrong. And the invisible architecture of rules, signals, and social machinery that creates it, without anyone ever saying a single word out loud. Let me tell you about an experiment. In 2003, a social psychologist named Dacher Keltner ran a study at UC Berkeley. He took a group of students, split them randomly into two groups, told one group they were in charge, gave the other group nothing. Then he put a plate of 5 cookies in the middle of the table. There were 5 people. 5 cookies. Which means, socially, you take one, you leave the last one. That's the rule. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody announced it. You just know. But because your nervous system is running a very old piece of code that says, when someone breaks a rule, something unpredictable is happening. Unpredictable means danger. Sociologist Erving Goffman spent his career studying what he called the interaction order, the invisible choreography that governs how human beings move through shared space. His core argument was radical, and it still disturbs people when they really sit with it: society does not exist. Only the performance of society exists. He meant this literally. The rules that govern your behavior in public? They have no existence outside of the moment you follow them. There is no rulebook. There is no referee. There is only the shared, silent, moment-to-moment agreement that we will all keep performing as though the rules are real. And when someone stops performing, when someone faces the wrong way in the elevator, or takes the last cookie, or refuses to laugh at their boss's joke, or sits in the wrong chair at the meeting, the whole system feels like it might fall apart. This is why unspoken rules are so much more powerful than written ones. A written rule can be argued with. You can find a loophole. You can say you didn't know. An unspoken rule? You always knew. That's what makes it unspoken. The entire point is that everyone knows, and the knowing is enforced by the terror of being the person who breaks it. And somewhere, right now, in your life, there are rules you are following that you have never once examined. Rules you inherited. Rules that were handed to you before you were old enough to question them. Rules that are, right now, shaping what you say, where you sit, who you look at, what you want, and who you think you are. Let's start looking at them. Every human social environment has what sociologists call a status order. A hierarchy. And here's what's remarkable about those hierarchies: they almost never need to be announced. Think about your first week at a new school. A new job. A new social group of any kind. Within days, sometimes hours, you knew who was at the top. You knew who had power. You knew which conversations happened in which rooms, which opinions were allowed to be said out loud, and which ones you should keep to yourself. Nobody told you. You just read it. The question is, what were you reading? Because the signals are everywhere, and they are extraordinarily subtle. Researcher Michael Krauss at Yale has spent years studying what he calls social class cues, the tiny, mostly unconscious signals people use to broadcast and detect status. And his findings are genuinely uncomfortable. People from higher status backgrounds, Krauss found, are worse at reading other people's emotions. Not because they're less intelligent, but because they don't have to pay attention. When you grow up with resources, financial, social, institutional, you don't need other people as much. Your survival doesn't depend on accurately reading the room, anticipating what the person in front of you wants, knowing when someone's patience is running out. But when you grow up without those resources, when your social environment is less stable, when the people around you have more power over your circumstances, You become extraordinarily good at reading people. You have to. This is the dark first principle of unspoken rules. The people who benefit from the rules are almost always the ones who don't notice them. Because the rules were written for them. By their predecessors. By the culture that produced them. The rules are water. And they are fish. They don't feel the water because the water is exactly the right temperature for them. Everyone else is noticing the water constantly. Let me give you an example that might make this concrete. The talking in meetings problem. Almost every large organization in the Western world has it. Certain people talk a lot in meetings. Other people barely speak at all. And almost without fail, the people who talk the most are rewarded, with attention, with credit, with advancement, regardless of whether what they said was better. Multiple studies confirm this. One famous analysis of Fortune 500 board meetings found that the person who spoke most confidently, most frequently, and at the highest volume was rated as more competent by everyone in the room, even when their ideas were objectively inferior. Now, why? Because there is an unspoken rule operating in that room. The rule is not good ideas win. The rule is, whoever most confidently performs the role of person who has good ideas wins. And this is a rule that is enormously easier to follow if you grew up in an environment where you were constantly told that your voice mattered. That your opinions were worth sharing. That speaking up was safe. If you grew up in an environment where speaking up was punished, by a parent, a teacher, a community, the meeting room feels like a trap. You know things. You have ideas. But every time you prepare to speak, a very old alarm goes off somewhere deep in your nervous system. And the person across the table, who has no idea any of this is happening, looks at you and sees someone who doesn't have much to contribute. The unspoken rule punishes you not for what you are, but for where you came from. And it does it silently. Invisibly. Without anyone in that room ever having made a conscious choice to exclude you. This is what makes unspoken rules so insidious. Unlike explicit discrimination, unlike conscious cruelty, there's no one to point at. No one to accuse. No policy to change. There's just the invisible architecture. Running quietly in the background. Every day. Sociologist Pierre Bourdieu called this symbolic violence. Violence that doesn't leave marks. Violence that the victim often participates in and enforces on themselves. He said the most efficient form of domination is one that never needs to announce itself. Think about the handshake. In Western professional culture, the handshake is supposed to be a simple, neutral greeting. But it's not neutral. It never was. The firmness. The duration. Eye contact or not. Who extends their hand first? Whether you match energy or lead it. Every single variable is being read and rated and used to instantly form an impression of your confidence, your social class, your cultural background, your personality. And none of it was ever written down. None of it will ever be explained to you. If you grew up somewhere where the handshake worked differently, or didn't exist at all, you will be judged by a standard you were never given access to. And the person judging you will not think of themselves as judging you. They'll just have a feeling about you. A vague sense that something was slightly off. That cold, wrong feeling. Except now you're on the other side of it. In the early 1960s, a psychologist named Paul Ekman began studying something that most people in his field considered too small to bother with. Facial microexpressions. Involuntary muscle movements in the face that last between 1/15th and 1/25th of a second. Too fast for conscious perception. Too fast for the person making them to control. Ekman spent decades cataloging them. He found that these flickers, these tiny, uncontrollable betrayals of the face, were universal across cultures. Cross-cultural. Hardwired. Fear looks the same on a face in Tokyo as it does in Nairobi as it does in Oslo. And more disturbingly, contempt is almost impossible to fake. Or hide. The contempt micro-expression is a unilateral lip curl. One side of the mouth. Less than 1/10 of a second. And it means, with remarkable consistency, that the person making it believes they are better than you. If you've ever been in a conversation with someone and come away feeling vaguely unsettled, feeling as though you weren't quite respected, even though nothing was said, you may have clocked a contempt micro-expression without consciously knowing it. Your conscious mind missed it. Your unconscious mind did not. This is the second layer of unspoken rules. The first layer is structural, the written-on-water rules about who sits where and who speaks when and what a handshake should feel like. The second layer is biological. Your body is constantly broadcasting information you don't intend to broadcast. And it is constantly receiving signals that never make it to conscious awareness. Posture, breathing rate, pupil dilation, micro-movements of the hands, the tiny elevation or depression of the shoulders, the angle of the head. You are reading all of these signals in everyone around you, all of the time. And they are reading you. Research on thin slicing, the brain's ability to form accurate judgments from tiny fragments of information, consistently shows that people can accurately assess major personality traits from as little as 10 seconds of observation. 10 seconds of watching someone walk. 10 seconds of hearing someone speak. By the time you've introduced yourself at a party, the person you're speaking with has already formed a portrait of you that they will struggle, for the rest of the conversation, to revise. This is not cynical. This is not pessimistic. This is just your brain doing what it evolved to do. We are social primates. We have been reading each other for status, threat, and alliance for millions of years. The machinery for it runs deep. But here's where it gets genuinely dark. Because those judgments, those lightning fast, largely accurate, impossible to override first impressions. They encode bias. Not malicious bias. Not conscious bias. But the same mental machinery that correctly reads "this person is nervous" also reads, without your permission and often without your awareness, "this person reminds me of people I was taught to be afraid of." And the terrifying thing about unspoken rules, the thing that keeps me up at night if I think about it too hard, is that the rules are being executed by systems that are, at their deepest level, inaccessible to us. You cannot audit your own unconscious mind. You cannot ask it to show its work. You can only watch what it produces. And sometimes what it produces is a feeling, a cold, quiet, inexplicable certainty that you cannot justify and cannot override. There is a concept in psychology called confirmation bias. Once you have formed an impression of someone, your brain actively works to confirm that impression. It remembers evidence that supports it. It filters out evidence that contradicts it. So that first impression judgment, based on 10 seconds, based on micro-expressions and body language and whether someone's handshake reminded you of someone you once didn't trust, that judgment becomes the lens through which you see everything that person does next. And the person on the receiving end of that lens? They feel it. That low, cold certainty. That sense that something has already been decided. That they are the last person in the room to know. They weren't wrong. Let's talk about compliance theater. It is, I would argue, one of the most psychologically corrosive forces in modern life. And almost nobody names it. Compliance theater is what happens when everyone in a social system knows that a rule is pointless, counterproductive, or actively harmful, but everyone follows it anyway, because breaking it would cost too much. You know this feeling intimately. The meeting that could have been an email. The performance review that everyone knows is a formality. The mandatory training module that nobody believes will change anyone's behavior. The smile you smile in the group photo. None of this is new. Sociologists have been studying it for decades under different names: ritualism, organizational theater, bureaucratic performance. But what's new, or newer, is the scale at which it operates, and the psychological cost it extracts. Here is what compliance theater does to a person. When you perform a ritual you don't believe in, when you go through motions you know are meaningless, you are engaging in what psychologists call self-betrayal. There is a famous line from the philosopher Harry Frankfurt, who wrote a short book called On Bullshit. His argument was that the bullshitter is worse than the liar. The liar knows what the truth is. They choose to deceive you. They are, in their way, still oriented toward the truth. The bullshitter doesn't care about the truth at all. They are not lying to you. They are performing. They are producing sounds and shapes that approximate meaning without actually having any. And Frankfurt argued, and this is the part that I think really matters, that sustained exposure to bullshit degrades your relationship with the concept of truth itself. When you spend enough time performing rituals you don't believe in, saying words you know don't mean anything, following rules whose only purpose is to demonstrate that you're the kind of person who follows rules, something inside you starts to go quiet. Your inner signal, the thing that knows when something is true and when something is false, gets harder to hear. This is, I believe, what's happening to a lot of people right now. Not a crisis of information. Not a problem of complexity. A crisis of performed meaning. The philosopher Albert Camus wrote about what he called the absurd, the gap between human beings' desperate need for meaning and the universe's absolute silence on the subject. But I think there's a more immediate absurdity that most of us live with every day. The gap between what institutions say they value and what they actually reward. Almost every organization in the world claims to value honesty, authenticity, creative thinking, psychological safety. And then, in practice, it rewards compliance, smoothness, the performance of confidence, the strategic management of perceptions. This creates a very specific kind of cognitive dissonance. You are simultaneously told, be yourself, and perform being yourself in a way that is acceptable to us. You are told, we value your honest opinion, and do not say that. The unspoken rule, the one that nobody will write down or acknowledge, is almost always louder than the spoken one. Psychologist Chris Argyris called this the gap between espoused theory and theory in use. Espoused theory is what people say they believe. Theory in use is what their behavior reveals they actually believe. His decades of research at Harvard and Yale found that this gap is almost universal, and almost universally invisible to the people it affects. Everyone in that meeting knew what the real rules were. Nobody acknowledged them. And because they were never acknowledged, they could never be questioned, or changed, or held accountable. The unspoken rule protects itself by remaining unspoken. The moment you name it, it loses some of its power. Which is exactly why the people who benefit from it will always find a way to make naming it feel inappropriate. You're overthinking it. Don't be so sensitive. That's just how it works. These are not explanations. They are instructions to stop looking. In 1968, a sociologist named Philip Jackson published a book called Life in Classrooms. It was, on its surface, a study of what happens in elementary school classrooms. But what Jackson found, and what became enormously influential in educational sociology, was that schools teach two entirely separate curricula at the same time. The first curriculum is the official one. Math, science, history, the things on the syllabus. The second curriculum, the one Jackson called the hidden curriculum, is everything else. The hidden curriculum teaches you how to wait. How to ask permission before meeting your own needs. How to perform engagement whether or not you're actually engaged. How to manage authority, how to appear cooperative to people who have power over you, regardless of whether you agree with them. How to compete, but within prescribed limits, and never in ways that make the person grading you uncomfortable. It teaches you, in other words, all of the unspoken rules you will need for the rest of your life. And here is the deeply uncomfortable thing about the hidden curriculum: it was not designed. Nobody sat in a room and said, let's teach children to suppress their authentic responses and perform compliance for institutional authority. It simply emerged. From the structure of classrooms. From the logic of managing 30 children in one room with one adult. From the reward systems that developed organically over decades. And once it emerged, it became invisible, because everyone it produced believed it was natural. Sociologists Samuel Bowles and Herbert Gintes, in their landmark 1976 work Schooling in Capitalist America, made an even harder argument. They said the hidden curriculum isn't an accident. It's a feature. Their argument was that the primary function of mass education, the function it actually serves, as opposed to the function it claims to serve, is to produce workers who are already trained in the dispositions that industrial and post-industrial economies require. Punctuality. Tolerance of hierarchy. The ability to perform motivated engagement on tasks you didn't choose. The suppression of self-directed behavior when it conflicts with institutional demands. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not saying they were entirely right. Education does all kinds of things. There are genuinely transformative teachers. There are real moments of awakening in classrooms. But think about which behaviors got you in trouble in school. Not ignorance. Not lack of curiosity. Curiosity that went in the wrong direction, that asked the wrong questions, at the wrong time, in the wrong way. Independence that didn't fit the prescribed form. The hidden curriculum doesn't punish you for being stupid. It punishes you for being inappropriately smart. For noticing the wrong things. For saying them at the wrong moment. For looking too closely at the chair in the corridor and asking why it's there. There's a concept in psychology called learned helplessness. It was first demonstrated by Martin Seligman in 1965, through experiments that, by modern standards, were deeply troubling in their methods. But the principle they revealed has been replicated hundreds of times in the decades since. When an organism is repeatedly exposed to negative stimuli that it cannot control or escape, when it learns, again and again, that its actions make no difference to the outcome, it eventually stops trying to escape. Even when escape becomes possible. Even when the door is open. The organism has learned that trying is pointless. And it has internalized that lesson so deeply that it cannot recognize the changed circumstances. I am not making a direct comparison here. Human beings are far more complex than the organisms in Seligman's original experiments. But I want you to think, carefully and honestly, about the areas of your life where you have stopped trying. Where you stopped raising your hand. Where you stopped saying the thing you were actually thinking. Where you stopped believing that what you wanted was something you were allowed to want. And ask yourself when that started. And who was in the room when it did. Let's talk about the people who understand all of this and use it deliberately. Because they exist. There is a literature on what researchers sometimes call social dominance orientation, the degree to which a person desires hierarchical relationships between groups, and is motivated to maintain those hierarchies. People with high social dominance orientation are not rare. They are found in every culture, every institution, every family. And they are extraordinarily skilled at using unspoken rules as mechanisms of control. Here's how it works. Imagine you join a new organization. A company, a community, a social group. You are given the official rules. The employee handbook. The community guidelines. The stated values. And then, if you're paying attention, you start noticing that there's another set of rules. Running underneath. Never stated. Who you have to compliment before your ideas get taken seriously. Which topics are forbidden, even though they're not on any list. Who is allowed to be late to which meetings. Who has to pre-clear their opinions before expressing them. Who is allowed to be visibly tired. Who is not. A person with high social dominance orientation, consciously or not, is the person writing those rules. Or maintaining them. Or enforcing them without ever acknowledging they exist. And the mechanism of enforcement is brilliant in its cruelty. Because the rule is never stated, you can never break it deliberately. You can only break it accidentally. By not knowing. And not knowing, not having been given access to the rules, is coded as a character flaw. They just don't get it. They don't read the room well. I don't know, there's just something about them. This is social exclusion with built-in deniability. Nobody did anything wrong. Nobody discriminated. Nobody was unkind. There was just a feeling. Researcher Robin Ely at Harvard Business School has spent years studying what she calls identity-based exclusion, the way people are kept out of influential networks not through explicit discrimination but through the management of access to informal social capital. And once that conclusion is reached, once a person has accepted the explanation that they are the problem, that their perception is faulty, that what they feel doesn't correspond to what's real, the control is total. Because now they're enforcing it themselves. I want to talk about the cost. Not the obvious cost, the missed opportunities, the stifled careers, the relationships that never quite formed because something was always being held back. I want to talk about the quieter cost. The psychological literature on what happens to people who spend years, decades, chronically suppressing authentic responses in order to maintain social acceptability. James Gross at Stanford has spent 30 years studying emotion regulation, how people manage and modify their emotional responses. He distinguishes between two primary strategies. Reappraisal, changing how you think about a situation so that you feel differently about it. This is healthy. This is, in essence, what therapy tries to do. And suppression, just not showing it. Feeling the thing, but performing as though you're not. Here is what suppression costs you, according to Gross's research. More sympathetic nervous system activation. Higher blood pressure. More cortisol. Impaired memory for the events during which you suppressed. Reduced quality of social interaction. The people you're interacting with also feel less connected to you, even though they can't usually say why. Suppression doesn't make the feeling go away. It makes it worse, in ways that stay hidden from you and from everyone around you. And here is what decades of chronic suppression, required by environments that systematically punish authentic expression, does to a person's sense of self. It creates what psychologist Winnicott called the false self. A performance so sustained, so thoroughly practiced, so deeply ingrained that it eventually becomes, at least in some social contexts, the only version of yourself you can access. You have adapted. You have become what the environment required. You have learned to follow the rules so automatically that you no longer experience yourself as following them, you experience yourself as being them. And then, in a quiet moment, on a long drive, or at 3 in the morning, or the day something major shifts in your life, you have that experience that so many people describe and so few can explain. A sense of profound unfamiliarity with yourself. Of having been living slightly beside your own life. Of not being sure when you try to access what you actually want, not what you're supposed to want, not what would be acceptable to want, what that is. That is the cost. Not dramatic. Not acute. Just a slow, quiet, expensive distance from yourself. Accumulated over years of unspoken rules followed without examination. I want to be honest with you about something. This video is not going to give you a system. It's not going to give you a list of 7 steps to freedom from unspoken rules. Because that would be, ironically, another compliance trap. Here are the right things to do to be the right kind of person who has successfully escaped social conditioning. The rules would just change shape. What I can offer instead is something that I think is genuinely more useful. A practice of noticing. Because the power of unspoken rules comes entirely from their invisibility. The moment you see the rule, the moment you can name it, even internally, even just to yourself, it stops being air and starts being a thing. A thing you can examine. A thing you can choose to follow or not. A thing with a history and an origin and a purpose that you can interrogate. The philosopher Michel Foucault spent his career mapping what he called regimes of truth, the invisible systems through which societies determine what counts as real, what counts as sane, what counts as acceptable. His argument, and it's a radical one, was that these systems are not natural. They are not inevitable. They are constructed. And what is constructed can be examined. What can be examined can be changed. Here is a practical version of that. The next time you feel that cold, wrong feeling, that sense that something has already been decided, that you're the last person to know, instead of dismissing it, try to name it. Not to anyone else, necessarily. Just to yourself. What rule is being broken? Or, what rule are you being asked to follow without being told? What is the gap between what is being said and what is being done? Who benefits from that gap staying invisible? This is not about becoming paranoid. This is not about seeing conspiracies everywhere or treating every social interaction as a power struggle. Most unspoken rules are benign. Many are genuinely useful: the elevator choreography, the social turn-taking in conversation, the 1,000 small conventions that allow human beings to share space without constant negotiation. What we're talking about is the ones that aren't benign. The ones that are enforced through shame, through exclusion, through the strategic management of information, through the quiet, persistent suggestion that your perception of events is not to be trusted. Those are the ones worth seeing. There's a term in systems theory: double-loop learning. Single-loop learning is when you notice a problem and fix the specific problem. Double-loop learning is when you notice a problem and ask, what about the way this system is structured is creating this problem? And you change the structure. Most organizations, and most people, are stuck in single-loop mode. We fix the symptom. We deal with the situation. We adapt. Double-loop learning is harder and rarer and almost always involves a moment of genuine discomfort. Because it means questioning something you previously accepted as given. It means looking at the chair in the corridor and not walking past it. And not pretending you didn't notice. Underneath all of the unspoken rules, the status signals, the compliance theater, the hidden curriculum, the exclusions so invisible they have no fingerprints, underneath all of it, I believe there is one rule. The rule that all the other rules are protecting. The rule is this: do not disturb the story we are telling about who we are. Every institution, every culture, every family, every social group runs on a story. A narrative about what it values, what it stands for, who the good people are and what the good people do. And the unspoken rules, the real ones, the ones with teeth, are not primarily about behavior. They are about narrative protection. The reason you're not supposed to point out that the meeting is a waste of everyone's time is not because your observation is wrong, everyone knows it's right, but because the meeting is part of the story the organization tells about itself. That it values communication. That everyone's voice matters. That decisions are made collaboratively. If you say the meeting is pointless, you're not just making an observation about time management. You're threatening the story. And stories, when they are the kind that entire institutions or cultures or families have built themselves around, stories that people have organized their entire identities in relation to, are defended with extraordinary ferocity. This is why whistleblowers lose their jobs. Not because they were wrong. Because they were right in the wrong way. In a way that disrupted the narrative. This is why the person who names the dynamic in the dysfunctional family, who says out loud what everyone is thinking but nobody will say, becomes the problem. Not the thing they named. Them. The scapegoat, in family systems theory, serves a function. They absorb the family's anxiety about its own dysfunction. As long as attention is directed at the person who noticed the problem, it doesn't have to be directed at the problem itself. This pattern, the person who sees the thing being made into the thing, is one of the most reliably documented patterns in social psychology. And it happens at every scale. In families. In companies. In nations. So what do you do with that? If naming the thing makes you the thing. If seeing the rule makes you a threat to the rule. If the cold, wrong feeling is, as it usually is, correct. And the correct response to it puts you in danger. I don't have a clean answer. I don't think there is one. But I think there is something. I want to come back to where we started. That feeling. That cold, wrong certainty that something has already been decided. That you are the last to know. I said at the beginning that this feeling is almost never wrong. I want to be precise about what I mean. It's not that the specific threat is always real. It's not that every room is rigged against you. It's not that every authority figure is running a hidden agenda. What's almost never wrong is the feeling that rules exist that you haven't been told. That the social environment you're in has a logic, and that logic is not the stated one. That the story being told about what's happening is not the only story. And being able to hold that awareness, calmly, without paranoia, without despair, is one of the more valuable things a human being can develop. The philosopher Simone Weil wrote about what she called attention. Not focus, exactly. Not concentration on a task. But a kind of open, patient, receptive watching. A willingness to look at something, a person, a situation, a system, without immediately reaching for a conclusion. Without immediately reaching for the story that makes you comfortable. She thought this kind of attention was rare. And that it was, in a meaningful sense, the basis of genuine ethical engagement with the world. You cannot respond to what you cannot see. You cannot question what you do not know exists. The chair in the corridor disturbs you because it doesn't fit the story. Corridors don't have chairs in them. Chairs face rooms. Things have their proper places. The card says they know. But maybe the more important question isn't what they know. Maybe it's whether you know. Whether you know, now, what the rules are. Where they came from. Who they serve. What following them costs, and what questioning them risks. And what you are going to do with that knowledge. The most radical thing you can do in a world built on rules nobody will acknowledge is simply to notice them. Name them. Hold them up to the light. And decide, consciously, deliberately, as an act of self-possession, which ones you actually believe in. Pay attention to what no one will say out loud. That's where the real conversation is.